Welcome to Stories Beyond Borders, the podcast where culture, identity, and personal journeys come together. I'm your host, Urmi, and in each episode we sit down with voices from around the world to talk about what it means to belong, to move, to grow, and to find home. Whether you're a third culture kid, an expat, or someone redefining identity on your terms, these are your stories too.
My guest today is Rohene Bouajram, an award-winning educator, leadership coach, and internationally recognized speaker. Bridging her Zimbabwean-Canadian identity, she redefines leadership by inspiring women of color, breaking cultural biases, and driving systemic change. With over 2 decades in higher education and experience across 4 continents, Rohene brings powerful insights on equity, leadership, and transformation. Let's welcome Rohene. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing great, Urmi. Thank you so much for having me here and excited for our conversation.
Yes, thank you for coming. And I'm going to start with my standard question, which is, what is your story?
Oh, what a beautiful way to begin. I'll begin by first grounding myself in joining everyone from the ancestral, traditional, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish people, Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations, otherwise known as Vancouver, British Columbia. And I came to Canada as an uninvited guest from Zimbabwe, specifically from 2 towns, Marandera, where I spent most of my childhood, and then Harare, which is the capital city where I spent my childhood and adolescence before coming to Canada as a late teenager in terms of adolescence-wise. So my story begins from coming from a country that I truly love. I was able to, in Zimbabwe, be surrounded by many family members, be exposed to generational ancestral wisdom. I was able to meet my great-grandmother and obviously my grandparents, and I know that is not something that is the norm for many people, as I've come to now discover living in Canada. I had fond memories of having social activities like weddings and celebratory milestones that really helped me understand what it is like to be in community, both as a member and as somebody who has received that level of support. And I say all of this because I think for many immigrants, when you move to a different country, mine included, we forget, at least I did, of what we were leaving behind. And for me, those were the losses amongst the gains of coming to Canada. And so when I came to Canada, I came here, I started university, also started my career at the same time, and dedicated 20 plus years to working in higher education as an educator. But I also have built a business that is focused on consulting and coaching, and then also have been able to really think about my ultimate mission right now, which is how do we redefine the faces of leadership. So that's a little bit about my story.
So I do have a few questions for you. 1, at what age you came to Canada? 2, you said you were an invited guest, right? Okay, yeah. So if you can expand a little bit more on those.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll start off with, I came to Canada when I was 17 years old. And so very much, I would say, coming to Canada as a very sheltered young girl. I was very lucky and very fortunate to grow up in a culture and an environment where girls were supported, but also limited by what they could do. You know, going to university was not the norm for many of my cousins and my family. And so in many ways, I was shattering what would be defined as glass ceilings and expanding the possibilities of what I could do as a young 17-year-old when I came to Canada. And the reason why I say uninvited guest is, I think for many countries, when we look at the historical, cultural, and obviously layers of what our countries have gone through. Zimbabwe went through a period of colonization. In fact, it gained independence in 1980. And I was born a few years after that. And so the world that I knew when I was, a wee child was a world that was still being created and constructed in terms of moving away from segregation to now what would be now open kind of mixing. And yet I grew up in an environment where still there were layers of racism, layers of discrimination, layers of those limitations. And so when I came to Canada, like again, I think for many of us who have journeys related to immigration or diaspora, or sometimes much more painful pathways of leaving our areas to seek refuge for safety and, out of fear of persecution, we're coming to Canada to seek, a better future, better postures, better opportunities. And it wasn't until I came to Canada that I realized, probably about in the first 2 years of being here, that Canada had an equally historic, violent, disturbing history. When we look at what has happened and what continues to persist in relation to Indigenous and First Nations communities. And so I had to really wrestle and reconcile with, here I was leaving a country, my home, Zimbabwe, that also went through its own evolution of independence and historical violence under the British colonized system. And then doing the same, coming here, settling in a country as an immigrant. And so for me, when I ground myself in acknowledging the land and saying that I'm an uninvited guest and a settler, I'm recognizing that I have a responsibility, that by making a choice to come here, I also need to understand what has happened and what has transpired on this land. And so to educate myself and then to move that knowledge mobilization into action, especially given the calls to truth and reconciliation. And what does that mean, not only in my day-to-day, but also in my work and also in my parenting when I am raising a beautiful little boy on these lands. And then even in my business, as I think about how do I think of redefining the faces of leadership in supporting women of color, and that includes Indigenous, Black, and racialized women in some of the leadership coaching that I do. And so that for me is what uninvited guest means. Uninvited, that nobody actually asked me to come, but I made a choice to come. And that guest is to always recognize that there's a responsibility to being here, because this is not necessarily my home. This is somebody else's home that was that has layers of being stolen and erased.
Wow, you did say it in a very beautiful way, I have to say. And I didn't know Zimbabwe got their independence in 1980s. Like, if you think about it from a relative perspective, it's quite recent, if we have to say, if we have to be honest. Yeah, it's quite recent.
Absolutely.
So that's new to me. And it's also not very common for me to see people that come from Zimbabwe. Like, you're probably the first one, I have to say, in Canada.
Yeah.
And I don't know, is there like a big community in Canada or in Vancouver?
Yeah. Oh my gosh, Urmi, I'm glad that you're asking me that question, and I would love to also hear what your experience was. Honestly, when I arrived in 2002 in Canada, no, there was not a big community of Zimbabweans, let alone Africans, in Vancouver. Now, that was not the case for other provinces. I had family who, when they came, they moved to Calgary, they moved to Toronto, and then there were definitely bigger communities of Zimbabweans and Zambians and Ghanaians and Nigerians, but not in Vancouver. And in fact, there's this kind of almost unintentional kind of way of knowing that when you are walking, from one end to another, like on a street, or in my case, I spent a good chunk of my early years in Canada on university campuses, that I would go days, if not months, and sometimes even felt like years, not seeing anyone who not only looked like me, but certainly didn't have my background. And so it was hard. And that was probably part of the isolation that I felt when I was here in Canada in the early years. The imposter syndrome of not feeling like I belonged here, and then eventually finding community in other ways. Now, I can say, thankfully, fast forward to 2025, where we're having this conversation, the communities now in British Columbia has increased. I now am seeing more individuals who are coming from Zimbabwe, from Zambia, from Ghana, from Nigeria, from the Caribbean, from Jamaica. And so it is nice to be able to see that the Black community is expanding. But the Black community was actually always thriving in British Columbia. And this was way before my time. And so I think when we think of the Canadian context, particularly in relation to a lot of historically, systemically, and marginalized communities like the Black community, but there are also many others, we can start to believe, right, based on when we come to Canada, in my case, 2002, that somehow we were never here. And that's not true. Canada has a connection to the transatlantic slave trade. If you look at the history in Nova Scotia and in, and the rich history of the impact of the Black community in Halifax. So I've had to really, for myself, think about not just my experience of coming to Canada from Zimbabwe, but also what has that meant on a national scale in terms of the Canadian fabric of immigrant journeys, diaspora journeys, refugee journeys, in being able to know that there are, whether there are ancestors or someone else's ancestors, that our presence has been here. Yeah, would love to hear if you felt that way for you as well.
When I moved to Canada, you mean, or just?
Yeah.
No, I was as in like my community.
Your heritage, your culture.
No, it was not like that in Canada, but it was like that in Italy. Because I can tell you that when my parents moved from Bangladesh to Italy, and we're talking about the 80s and the 90s, it was a little bit like you explained, like there was not a community, like the community was starting in those years. So it was really the first flow of like Bengali people moving from Bangladesh to Italy was in the 80s and the 90s. So I would say my parents are part of that first flow of immigration. And only later on, you start to see a lot more Bengali people. Like now, if you go to Italy, Bengali people, like, they're everywhere, like literally everywhere.
Yeah.
But, and at the end of the day, I feel like we all move for the same reason, better opportunities, better future, we're looking for better jobs. And at the end, that's what keeps us moving. And and this was my experience with my own in Italy with my parents. And I can definitely tell you that I had a similar thing as you when I was growing up in Italy, in the sense that there was no one that looked like me. I was born in Italy, raised in Italy, but when I went to school, people that I had around me were pretty much Italian. And so I felt like I had to take time to educate the people around me, because it was relatively new for them to have someone that doesn't look like them. And it was also a work for me to educate myself a little bit about my surroundings. And I grew up predominantly in an Italian environment. And let me tell you this, not having someone that looks like you, sometimes you start to wonder, where do I fit in?
Yeah. And if you'll fit in. Yeah. And I hear you.
Exactly. And so one of the follow-up questions that I had for you was, did you feel lonely? And you did answer that you felt lonely. And how was it afterwards, navigating this, I want to say, I don't know if I would call it duality, you are in this old Canadian world, and then you have also your heritage and, you know, where you're coming from and how it was back at home and how it is in this new place that probably it is your home, I'm assuming.
Yeah.
How was it afterwards to navigate this?
Yeah, you know, it's such it's an interesting question that you ask, because I can imagine if you asked me this question at different points in my 20 plus years of living in Canada, I would have a very different answer. So I'm part of me is like, I wonder how I would have answered this, you know, even 10 years ago. And so I think for me right now, I'm very comfortable with the duality. I'm now much more reflective of how I can bridge my Zimbabwean identity and now what has become the Canadian identity that I have. I'm far more comfortable with ambiguity and what feels like sometimes this third space that hangs between the two and is embedded in the hyphenate of Zimbabwean-Canadian. I will say that when, after coming to Canada, about a few years after being here, I made my first visit back. And I think of how many of us, you know, we long for going back, eating the food, seeing our friends, seeing our family, you know, and I really had that. I had all of those excitements and motivations and desires. And when I remember my first trip back, everybody had changed. And it dawned on me that of course they would change, because 3-4 years had gone by. And so I had this idea of who people were stuck in my own time frame that was so different to who they were when I came back. And so some of the conversations that we could have were just different. They weren't the same. And so that's when I think for the first time I realized I am different now. I'm not the Rohene that they reminded, and they're not the people that remembered, and they're not the people that I remembered. And so, and there's a lot of research that talks about the re-entry shock, you know, of cultural adaptation. And so I felt that. I felt that first trip. I felt it then 10 years later when I went back again, probably even more, because now the distance of how we could connect was even further apart. And so coming to, you know, to now where I am, and the question that you're asking is that ambiguity and that uncertainty and the discomfort of not feeling anchored to one versus the other. I now feel much more comfortable with it. And that took a lot of emotions. It took a lot of reflection. It took a lot of understanding that I didn't need to be just one thing. I could be multiple. And that duality of being multiple is now the most exciting thing, as I think about how to kind of pave a way for myself and for my family too.
Yeah, you know what? You touched upon many different things. I had another guest who also spoke about like herself going back to her country, to the country where she was born. So basically she was born in Bangladesh, then she lived most of her life in Dubai, outside of it. And then she went back to Bangladesh, and she said she had cultural shocks.
Yeah.
She had cultural shocks. And so you touched upon that. Mm-hmm. And she also felt the same thing, like how everything was different. And I'm assuming it's also normal too, you know, with time we all change, we all evolve. So it's part of it. It's part of the process. And I did like your last part, you know, being able to be part of this duality, you know, seeing this as a good thing, as a strength, because I feel the same way too. And so I could very much relate to what you have said. And I always say we should celebrate our diversity, where we come from, where we live. So it's honestly a beautiful thing. So as we are approaching the end of this conversation, I do want to ask you one last question, which is, what is the message that you want to leave us today?
I truly believe that I talk a lot in my work about this idea of illusions. I truly believe many of us are sometimes set up to think that there's only one way of seeing the world, through the way that, let's say, we've been conditioned, we've been raised, we have been led to believe. I think of, again, in the beginning of coming to Canada, a big part of my illusion was the only way that I will belong is if I adopt the ways of, being more Canadian and less of Zimbabwean. And then thankfully realized that's not the case. And so my message to each person who might be, listening or reflecting on the conversation we're having is, don't believe everything that you've been conditioned to believe. Seek the answers that will help you critically examine if those things are true, if those things serve you, if this is how you want to be and live in this world that we're in, and reconstruct the reality where everything that lights you up truly serves you to stay in that course. Because I think for many of us, we might be trapped in those illusions and we don't need to. So that would be my message to leave to those who are hearing and listening.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Rohene. So before we let you go, do you want to tell us how people can connect with you?
Absolutely. I love hearing from anyone and everyone. So please feel free to find me on LinkedIn under Rohene Bouajram. You can also find me on social media, specifically Instagram. And my handle is rohene.bouajram, as well as Unspeakable Leadership, which is my podcast. And then my website. If you just Google me, I think you'll find my website will come up, and drop me a line, send me a message. I love virtual coffee dates as well. So always happy to connect.
All right. Well, Rohene, thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you so much, Umi. I really appreciate the stories that you're curating and the platform for those stories. So thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Stories Beyond Borders. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Remember, home isn't always a place. Sometimes it's a story. Until next time, keep crossing borders and telling your story.